Everyone thought the soldier was one of their own, until the canine dog started circling him again and again. What was hidden in his gear left the entire base speechless. Here's the full story. Before we jump in, drop your favorite canine's name in the comments and hit that subscribe button. The early spring air at Fort Douglas clung heavy with the scent of pine and diesel. The morning sun crept over the horizon in streaks of gold, catching on the chain-link fences that rimmed the camp. There was the usual shuffle of boots over gravel, distant shouts from the training yard, and the rhythmic whistle of wind slipping through the radio tower. It was just after 0600 when Sergeant Kyle Renner released Shadow, the base's most trusted canine, from the back of his patrol vehicle. A 7-year-old Belgian Malinois, Shadow had served through 2 tours overseas, credited with more than a dozen successful explosives detections and tracking missions. But since being reassigned to Fort Douglas a year ago, he had settled into the quieter rhythm of domestic patrol until today. Kyle had barely stepped from the vehicle when Shadow's behavior shifted. The dog stood still, unusually still, not sniffing around like normal, not pacing the gravel or pulling toward the mess hall where the scent of eggs and burnt toast usually drew him. He was locked onto something or someone. A small group of soldiers was gathering at the southern edge of the barracks courtyard. Morning roll call. Nothing out of the ordinary, except Shadow wasn't looking at the group. He was looking at one man, Private First Class Mason Whitlock, newer to the base, transferred from Fort Bragg just 3 weeks ago. Quiet, polite, average marks on his fitness tests. Nothing about him stood out, until now. Shadow began to circle him. Not aggressively, not barking, but slowly, deliberately, the way he moved when scenting something unfamiliar. His body lowered a fraction, his nostrils flared, his tail stiffened. Kyle's eyes narrowed. Shadow completed one loop around the soldier, then another, then stopped just behind him. Still, ears forward, mouth closed. Kyle called the dog back, but Shadow ignored him. That had never happened before. Whitlock turned slowly, his face neutral, calm, a touch confused. But that calmness, too calm, made something twist in Kyle's gut. He stepped forward. "Private Whitlock, I'm going to need you to step aside for a moment." The soldier nodded without hesitation, his voice level, his eyes not darting. That was the first warning sign. Most soldiers would at least ask what was going on. He didn't. Shadow followed him, walking close, nostrils low to the ground. Kyle notified command that he was conducting a routine inspection. No alarms, no accusations. He asked Whitlock to open his tent. The flap lifted. Neatly made bed. Clean gear. Personal locker. Nothing outwardly suspicious. But then Shadow walked in and froze by the cot's left leg. A single bark. Then another. Then he sat. Alert posture. Not moving. That was his signal. Kyle stepped inside, heart ticking faster. He knelt and ran a gloved hand under the cot, and stopped. There was a faint seam in the floor canvas. He pulled gently. There was a patch of stitched fabric like a hidden pocket sewn beneath the mat. Inside, wrapped in an army green cloth, were 4 sealed envelopes. They were marked with foreign postage, and inside each was a micro SD card. One of them labeled simply, Doc 7, Terminal Blue. The commanding officer ordered a full investigation. Whitlock was taken into custody. No struggle, no protest, just a quiet nod. Inside the cards were encrypted files. A quick scan revealed partially corrupted schematics, sections of Fort Douglas, highlighted grids, and a number string repeated over and over again. 0930/T7, North Fence. Most baffling was that the information matched parts of Fort Douglas no outsider should have known. Old layouts, retired storage buildings, an underground water route that had not been in use since before the expansion in 2009. How did he know? And more importantly, who else knew? Kyle watched through the glass of the holding room. Whitlock sat straight, hands folded, not speaking, not panicked, just waiting. But waiting for what? 2 nights later, Kyle walked Shadow along the perimeter near the outer warehouses. The dog's energy had returned to normal, until they passed one of the old generator buildings. Without warning, Shadow stopped, stiffened. Another bark. Then he pulled sharply toward a nearby maintenance hatch. Kyle followed, heart-thudding. The hatch was supposed to be sealed, used only during flood season, but the bolt was loose. Kyle called it in. Inside, they found something hidden behind a false panel, a shortwave radio transmitter. Old tech, quiet, easily missed, and still warm to the touch. This wasn't Whitlock working alone. Kyle ran his hand along the corner and found a scrap of notepaper jammed into the crease. It read, "Clear signal 0930, 7th day, South Field." That was tomorrow. They brought Whitlock back in for questioning. He said nothing, not a word. Shadow sat just outside the glass, staring at him. Kyle kept thinking about the phrase Terminal Blue, Dock 7. There was no Dock 7 on the base. But 2 miles south of Fort Douglas was an old civilian freight depot, now used by the state for storage. Most soldiers didn't even know it existed. Shadow had been there once during a routine inspection, and tomorrow was the 7th day since Whitlock's arrival. How many others were there? How deep had the surveillance gone? Why the micro SD cards instead of digital transmission? The more Kyle turned it over, the more tangled it became. Shadow, unshaken, alert, watching, was the only constant. And Kyle trusted his partner more than any man in uniform, because if one spy had slipped through the gates unnoticed, what if there was another still inside? The next morning, the base shifted into a controlled hum of quiet urgency. No official alert had gone out, not yet. But inside Fort Douglas, officers were moving with silent coordination. The 0930 timestamp on the intercepted note was now less than 2 hours away. Sergeant Kyle Renner stood outside the operations tent, watching the horizon turn from gray to gold. Shadow sat beside him, perfectly still, ears pivoting at each passing sound. His focus had only intensified since yesterday's discovery. Every muscle in his frame stayed tense, alert, not in fear but readiness. Kyle's mind ran circles. Why leave a trail like that? Why not destroy the map? Why keep a paper note in an era of encrypted messaging? Unless it wasn't just sloppiness. Unless Whitlock wanted it to be found. Or worse, someone else was supposed to find it. By 9, Kyle had assembled a small team and was already en route to the abandoned freight depot south of base. The one barely anyone talked about anymore. The area had been inactive since a warehouse fire 3 years back. Most of the access roads were overgrown with wild grass and tire-worn mud. The building marked Terminal 7 was mostly intact, though the signage was half-faded. A broken panel hung loose near the loading dock. To most, it would look like nothing more than a crumbling storage site, but to someone like Shadow, it was full of scent. The moment the patrol vehicle stopped, Shadow's body shifted. He barked once and launched toward the far side of the warehouse, dragging hard on the leash. Kyle followed, heart-pounding. Behind the building, tucked behind a stack of rusted pallets, was a storm access grate, half-concealed, partially open. Inside it, footprints, fresh ones, and something else, cigarette ash. No one on base smoked anymore. It had been banned 2 years ago. Shadow growled low, then circled. Another bark. They breached the building through the east wall. Inside was a space that should have been long empty. Instead, they found it swept clean, bare floors, a makeshift cot tucked behind a stack of crates, 2 empty water bottles, and a backpack. Inside the pack were a burner phone with 1 number saved, MW, a photo of Fort Douglas, printed and annotated in pen, and a small laminated ID, one that clearly belonged to a soldier, but not the one expected. The name read Lance Corporal Darius Kinley, but Darius wasn't missing. He was back at Fort Douglas, right now. Back at the base, Darius was on morning rotation in the communications room. He had clearance but no operational authority. Quiet, much like Whitlock. Strong record. Nothing alarming, until now. Shadow was brought in again, this time to the comms bunker, and as soon as they stepped inside, Shadow's behavior snapped sharp. He bolted toward the lockers and barked. Then again and again. Inside Kinley's locker, tucked beneath spare fatigues, they found a rolled-up canvas map identical to the one found under Whitlock's cot. Only this one had different markings. Red arrows, exit timings, rotational windows based on posted guard shifts. This was not just a lone infiltration. This was operational planning. Kinley was brought into holding without incident, his face unreadable, his answers non-existent, just like Whitlock. 2 soldiers, 0 cooperation, and the strangest part, no communication between them since Whitlock's arrest. Yet both had maps, both had matching materials. Shadow paced outside the cells, low growls rumbling with each pass. He barked hardest not at Kinley but at a small bench near the interrogation hallway. No one else paid it attention, but Kyle stepped over. Taped beneath the bench was a flash drive. It had not been there 2 hours ago. Security footage showed nothing. No one had passed by except Corporal Ellison, the duty officer that morning. Ellison was clean, or had been. 8 years in, high marks, good conduct. But when asked, he stumbled. Couldn't explain why he stopped outside the hall, claimed he had been called to respond to an equipment check. There had been no equipment check scheduled. The flash drive held only one file, an encrypted document named Phase 3.7, password locked. No way to break it on site. But it was enough for a formal investigation to begin. Ellison was removed from duty, placed under review. Now there were 3, but unlike the first 2, Ellison cracked, or seemed to. He claimed he had been pressured, coerced via blackmail, that his brother, serving time in state prison, had been threatened if he didn't pass along harmless messages. He never knew what they were about. Just relay, just deliver, but there was no record of such contact. No visit, no messages logged. Kyle knew something didn't add up. Too clean, too neat. If Ellison was playing a role, he was doing it well. The dog's senses became the pulse of the operation. Where humans hesitated, he followed. Shadow led Kyle to the perimeter fencing later that night, past the checkpoints, past the old fire lane that no longer had lighting. He barked at a small break in the brush, no more than a rabbit trail. But down that trail, hidden under a piece of painted plywood, was a buried container. Inside, a folded uniform with no name tag and a foreign-issued satellite phone. Clean, charged, 1 missed call from the same number on the burner phone found in Terminal 7. By week's end, the base was sealed under strict lockdown. Kyle stood alone in the debrief tent with Shadow at his side. 3 men detained, 1 flash drive still locked, and 1 sat phone with an active signal that still pinged every 48 hours from somewhere in the forested ridge west of the base. Kyle knew they were only scratching the surface. And yet, even through the uncertainty, one truth had been made undeniable. The only reason they had found any of it was Shadow. Without a single word, without a single command, he had led them. And still, his ears stayed forward, his eyes searching, like he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Snow began to fall again, thin and scattered, across the outer boundary of Fort Douglas. It was just after 2 a.m. The ridge line beyond the fence looked calm, but inside the base, no one slept. Security perimeters had tightened. External communication was restricted. And yet, something still felt off. Shadow had not rested since the last find. He paced in short lines inside the ops tent. His eyes would drift from the door to the window. His ears never relaxed. It was as if his instincts were pulling at something no one could yet see. Sergeant Kyle Renner had been up for 36 hours. His mind kept circling the unanswered question. If all 3 men had been caught, then why did it still feel like someone was missing? It was a handwritten detail in an old operations log that triggered the next thread. During Whitlock's early weeks at Fort Douglas, he'd participated in night drills paired closely with one name that kept coming up in shift overlaps and equipment signouts. Ford was quiet, mostly stayed under the radar. Never late, no complaints. His tent was in the outer row of the South Barracks. No connection had been found until now, except one thing. Back during the drill with Whitlock, Ford had signed out a military-grade field transmitter for navigation exercises, but had never returned it. A note in the system marked it possibly damaged, replaced later, except no replacement had been recorded. When asked, Ford said it was probably lost in a drainage ditch during storm cleanup. His tone was casual, too casual. Shadow was brought in again. No instructions needed. He didn't bark. He just walked directly to Ford's tent, then stopped and stared. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. Folded fatigues, a paperback thriller beside the cot, polished boots. But Shadow's nose pressed hard into the corner by the duffel bag. He sniffed, then growled low. Kyle reached in, unzipped the bag. Inside was a compact toolkit, a flashlight with a red filter lens, and beneath that, an empty slot lined in foam, custom-fitted for a transmitter. But it was missing, or maybe already in play. They brought Ford in for questioning. He denied everything, calm, even polite. Said he had nothing to hide. Said maybe Shadow was just reacting to someone else's gear. But then Kyle asked one simple question. When was the last time you saw Whitlock? Ford blinked, then said, I never met him, and that was the crack. Because everyone met Whitlock. He trained with them, drilled beside them, and Shadow, still watching through the security window, let out one deep bark, as if confirming what everyone else just realized. Ford had slipped. The flash drive from Ellison finally unlocked the next morning using a password generated from one of the cipher pages found in Kinley's locker. It contained a single spreadsheet, coordinates, base names, weekly movement logs, and one entry marked Fort Douglas, transmit window Friday, 2/22, 45 hours. The flash drive from Ellison finally unlocked the next morning using a password generated from one of the cipher pages found in Kinley's locker. It contained a single spreadsheet, coordinates, base names, weekly movement logs, and one entry marked Fort Douglas, transmit window Friday, 2/2, 45 hours. That was less than 18 hours away. Ford was detained. But even then, he did not flinch. Just smiled once, then said, You're already too late. Kyle didn't sleep that night, neither did Shadow. They combed the base, every radio tower, every service box, every crawl space, but nothing turned up. Until 1:52 a.m., Shadow bolted from his spot in the command tent. No bark, no sound, just movement, full sprint toward the northern observation post. Kyle followed. The old relay bunker sat under the tower. No longer active, it had been replaced 2 years prior, but someone had jimmied the door lock. Inside, under a lifted floor tile, lay the missing transmitter. It was live. A green light blinked once every 5 seconds. Sending data. Steady, precise, quiet. Kyle yanked the battery and crushed the SIM card. The signal died. 8 minutes before the transmit window closed. In the days that followed, no new arrests were made. No new confessions, but the ripple was massive. The Army launched a full investigation into protocol breaches. Intelligence branches analyzed every name that passed through Fort Douglas in the last year. The transmitter's data was incomplete, partial logs only, but the target was clear: base operations, personnel shifts, satellite schedules. Whitlock had started it. Kinley built the path. Ellison helped cover it. But Ford was the terminal piece, the silent one, the sleeper, the one who had nearly pulled it off. When the commanding officer addressed the troops later that week, there was no medal ceremony, no cameras, no public commendation, only quiet respect. But one name carried through the compound without needing to be spoken: Shadow, the dog who saw what no human did, who heard the silence before the sound, who followed trails long before maps were drawn. Kyle stood beside him outside the base gates that morning, watching the flags lift slow in the breeze. It could have ended differently. It almost had. And if it weren't for the K-9 who barked when no one else did, who circled a soldier when no one else looked twice, the signal might have been sent, the plan might have succeeded, and the damage would have spread far beyond Fort Douglas. Shadow lay at Kyle's feet now, head resting on his front paws. Calm, still, watching the road ahead, not chasing anything, just waiting. Because the thing about dogs like him, they don't need orders, they just know. And when danger hides in plain sight, sometimes the loudest warning comes on four legs with no words at all. Can you believe one dog stopped a spy ring in an army camp? Shadow's instinct saved lives, but this might just be the beginning. If you felt that chill too, hit that like button and subscribe now, because the next story might just top this one